cry, radar. That was the unwritten directive shoved in Gary Burghoff's face during his final episode on the massive hit MASH, a desperate corporate bid to squeeze out every last advertising dollar. But the second the cameras rolled, he dropped the naive act entirely. He ripped off his trademark knit beanie and thrust the balding, exhausted face of a man pushing 40 directly into the unforgiving lens. By intentionally destroying the 18-year-old illusion on national broadcast, Burghoff delivered the ultimate insult to the Hollywood machine. He would rather dismantle his own career and accept a permanent industry-wide freeze-out than continue contorting his body into a child just to serve the quarterly financial reports of Los Angeles executives. Network television in the 1970s was not an art form. It was a highly efficient industrial assembly line designed to sell soap, automobiles, and processed food to a captive American public. At the top of that broadcast food chain sat CBS, a corporate monolith that understood exactly how to package psychological comfort. They took the grim reality of a foreign conflict and sterilized it into a weekly half-hour of prime-time living room entertainment. At the absolute center of their most profitable property was a character designed specifically to disarm the viewer, a naive teddy bear-clutching farm boy named Radar O'Reilly. The network executives in New York sold the American public a heartwarming underdog. The viewing audience, looking for a distraction from a rapidly changing society, bought this sanitized illusion without a single second thought. But behind the heavy steel doors of the Los Angeles sound stages, the reality of creating that character was fundamentally toxic. The broadcast industry does not manufacture innocence without extracting a heavy permanent toll from the person tasked with projecting it. The reality behind the oversized glasses and the pristine Midwestern charm was built entirely on systeme, tick exhaustion, and exploitation. The true cost of top-tier television fame rarely happens on a studio lot. The damage usually surfaces on a quiet afternoon at a private residence, far away from the demanding glare of the camera lenses. Gary Burghoff was attempting to decompress by his private swimming pool in California. The sky was clear, the neighborhood was quiet, and the actor was completely alone. Then, a standard commercial airliner began its descent pattern, its jet engines roaring as it passed low overhead. Instantly, the actor's physical body completely bypassed his rational brain. Burghoff dropped what he was holding, and his frame involuntarily cowered into a defensive posture. Without a conscious thought, he began rapidly scanning the sky and verbally reporting the aircraft's position, altitude, and trajectory. He was shouting military logistics to an empty suburban backyard. He was not rehearsing a script or trying to stay in character for an upcoming shoot. He was experiencing a severe, involuntary neurological response to an everyday sound. The network public relations department loved to praise their actors for deep character immersion when it resulted in prestigious industry awards and magazine covers. The clinical reality was pure, unregulated psychological conditioning. Burghoff had been locked inside the mind of a hyper-vigilant, shell-shocked teenager for thousands of consecutive hours. His own central nervous system had been rewired by the production schedule to the point where it could no longer differentiate between a California residence and an active combat zone. The contrast between the broadcast image and the biological reality of the performer was jarring. Whenever the red light on the camera illuminated, Radar was an eternal adolescent. He was the perpetual beating heart of a billion-dollar television property, functioning as the moral compass for a cast of cynical characters. But when the director finally yelled cut at 2 a.m, ing, the illusion instantly collapsed. Gary was a grown man deep into his 30s, biologically depleted and mentally fractured from the effort. The network brass demanded that he continuously regress into a child to maintain their massive rating stronghold. There was absolutely no room in the production schedule for the man to age, mature, or exist outside the strict parameters of the studio's profit margins. Playing a teenager when you are an adult is not just an acting challenge, it is a brutal physical endurance test. Burghoff had to manually manipulate his vocal cords to pitch his voice higher for 14 grueling hours a day. He had to consciously alter his posture, shrinking his frame to appear smaller, weaker, and more vulnerable. The human body is not designed to sustain that level of constant conscious physical manipulation without eventually breaking down. The studio executives did not care about the physical toll, so long as the Nielsen ratings arrived on their desks every Monday morning, showing total market dominance. They viewed Burghoff not as a human being, but as a load-bearing pillar holding up their massive advertising revenue structure. If the pillar began to show stress fractures, the network's only proposed solution was to apply even more pressure. The entertainment trades always framed his eventual departure from the series as a colossal, unforced error. Hollywood columnists and rival producers could not fathom why any rational person would voluntarily walk away from the highest-rated program on the airwaves. They whispered in industry circles that it was a foolish career misstep born of sheer arrogance. They fundamentally misunderstood the mechanics of a captive psychological work environment. This exit was never a strategic career move or a calculated bid for better billing. It was a desperate, immediate survival escape from a corporate structure that was actively cannibalizing his identity. Burghoff looked at the trajectory of his life and realized he was being systematically erased by a fictional entity. He had to take a metaphorical knife and cut himself out of the television machine before it entirely consumed his capacity to function. It was the broadcast equivalent of a trapped animal gnawing off its own leg to get out of a steel trap. The executives at CBS operated under the firm assumption that every actor had a designated price. They believed that no matter how grueling the working conditions became, a larger paycheck would inevitably ensure total compliance. They were accustomed to managing massive egos, not mitigating severe, real-world mental distress. When Burghoff began signaling his physical and mental limits, the suits in the boardroom simply offered to increase his episodic fee. They entirely failed to recognize that they were dealing with a medical and psychological crisis, not a standard contract negotiation. The daily commute to the studio had transformed from a lucrative job into a prison sentence. Pulling through the heavy studio gates meant surrendering his autonomy to a machine that dictated his every movement, inflection, and thought process. The network demanded absolute loyalty to the brand, requiring him to participate in endless promotional tours and press junkets during his limited time off. He was expected to be radar on the set, radar in the grocery store, and radar during network affiliate dinners. The man named Gary was only allowed to exist in the brief, exhausting moments between falling asleep and the alarm clock ringing. The erosion of his personal identity was accelerating rapidly with every new television season. Friends and acquaintances noted that the nervous energy of the fictional character was bleeding into his actual personality. The stuttering, the hesitations, the physical tics, these were no longer just acting choices made for camera. They were becoming permanent neurological traits deeply embedded in his behavior. The studio had demanded a pound of flesh, and they were taking it directly from his central nervous system. Hollywood history is littered with performers who stayed at the party far too long, completely losing themselves to the characters that made them wealthy. Burghoff was acutely aware of this industry phenomenon. He watched his peers rely on heavy substances and alcohol to cope with the profound dissonance of playing perfect people on screen while their real lives disintegrated. He flatly refused to become another acceptable casualty of the studio system's aggressive extraction methods. The choice became definitively binary: remain on the top-rated show in the world and lose his mind, or walk away into the absolute unknown and attempt to salvage his sanity. The decision to leave was not made in a sudden fit of artistic pique or ego. It was a cold, rational assessment of his rapidly declining biological assets. He was looking down the barrel of a lifetime of irreversible psychological damage if he signed his name on another multi-year stint. The studio lawyers and highly paid agents tried to convince him that he owed it to the fans and to the network to stay in uniform. Burghoff correctly identified this as targeted corporate manipulation designed to guilt him into continued servitude. He understood perfectly that the moment his demographic ratings dipped, those same executives would discard him without a second thought. Loyalty in the television business is entirely transactional, flowing only in one direction. The machine demands total, unwavering sacrifice, but offers absolutely zero protection when the viewing public inevitably loses interest. Burghoff decided to beat them to the punch, reclaiming his personal agency before the network had the chance to drain the last drop of value from his performance. The friction on the set began to escalate significantly as his internal breaking point approached. Directors and producers accustomed to the compliant, eager-to-please actor of the early seasons found themselves dealing with a man who was entirely fed up with the process. Burghoff stopped tolerating the endless technical delays, the last-minute rewritten scripts, and the grueling late-night lighting setups. He was no longer willing to sacrifice his physical well-being just to ensure the network saved a few $1,000s on the weekly production budget. His changing, hardened demeanor was viewed by the brass as a severe breach of contract. In their eyes, they were paying him an exorbitant sum of money to be a professional product, and a product does not complain about the assembly process. They attempted to isolate him on set, using whisper campaigns to paint him as difficult and ungrateful within the wider industry. The studio machine is incredibly efficient at punishing internal dissent, utilizing access journalists to leak highly negative stories about actors who refuse to fall in line. But Burghoff was completely immune to their standard pressure tactics because he had already accepted the ultimate consequence. He no longer cared about securing his next starring role at CBS or maintaining his status on the Hollywood elite list. The threats of bad press and future unemployment rang completely hollow to a man who was simply fighting for basic cognitive survival. The executives were threatening to forcefully take away his career, completely failing to understand that he was desperately trying to give it away. The narrative surrounding his exit was carefully controlled by the studio publicists to protect the show's wholesome, profitable brand. They fed the press a sanitized, easily digestible story about an actor pursuing new creative avenues. This masked the brutal reality of a broken employee fleeing a deeply toxic work environment. The public was told a convenient lie because the truth was far too damaging to the primetime advertising sponsors. You cannot sell life insurance and laundry detergent during a broadcast if the audience knows the Belov. Ed Leading Man is suffering from severe psychological conditioning. The industry gossip columns, acting as an extension of the studio system, loved a greedy actor narrative. As the news of his impending departure broke, the press circulated aggressive rumors that Burghoff was simply holding out for cash. They printed unverified claims that he was demanding a massive, unprecedented pay raise to put the military uniform back on. That was a total calculated fabrication designed to turn the viewing audience against him. Burghoff walked straight into the executive offices and threw his million-dollar status back in their faces. He proactively initiated the exit because he recognized the television machine was permanently stripping away his right to be a father. The grueling production schedule meant he was completely absent from his own family's life, missing vital years of his children's growth. He was helping raise millions of viewers while entirely neglecting his own blood at home. He cornered himself intentionally, knowing that leaving was the only way to sever the corporate cord. He forced himself into a corner. He had to choose between saving his actual family or signing another lucrative, soul-crushing slave contract. The broadcast industry does not just want control of a performer's time, it demands absolute jurisdiction over their physical biology. The camera lenses of the 1970s were unforgiving tools managed by men who operated on a rigid corporate template of perfection. Network executives held a strict view of what an American television idol should look like, and any deviation was treated as a direct threat to advertising revenue. Gary Burghoff harbored a physical reality that the CBS brass deemed entirely unacceptable for primetime consumption. He was about to endure a grueling years-long campaign of physical concealment. Burghoff was born with a congenital condition known as dysmelia, which resulted in 3 shortened, deformed fingers on his left hand. In a functional real-world industry, this is simply a minor biological footnote that requires zero attention. In a Hollywood casting office, it was treated like a radioactive hazard that needed to be contained at all costs. The network executives looked at his hand and made a unilateral decision that it could never be shown to the viewing public. They determined that a deformed limb shattered the highly profitable illusion of the flawless, farm-fed boy they were selling. The studio did not fire him because his comedic timing and audience appeal were far too valuable to lose. Instead, they issued a strict, unwritten production mandate that governed his every movement on set. Burghoff was directly ordered to completely conceal his left hand during every single second of his screen time. For 7 consecutive years, the actor was forced to act as his own physical censor. He became an unwilling accomplice in the daily, systematic erasure of his own body. The sheer mechanical difficulty and muscular strain required to execute that mandate was immense. For up to 14 hours a day under baking studio lights, he had to consciously bury his hand deep inside his uniform pockets. When a scene specifically required him to stand at attention, salute, or handle paperwork, directors immediately handed him a clipboard. He had to master an awkward, highly unnatural grip, clamping his shortened fingers firmly behind the wood and metal out of the camera's sight line. The blocking of every scene was dictated not by natural movement, but by the desperate need to hide a human limb. This was not a passive wardrobe request. It required active, relentless physical tension from the moment the director called action. Every time Burghoff moved, gestured, or reached for a prop, a secondary calculation had to run constantly in his head. He could never simply exist organically within a scene like the rest of his castmates. His body was locked in a perpetual state of defensive positioning. T. O appeased the network's paranoid aesthetic standards. He was literally contorting himself to fit inside a corporate box. This sustained concealment went far beyond standard makeup requirements. It was a profound form of psychological abuse. The studio was systematically communicating a very specific damaging message to their breakout star. They were telling him day after day that his natural body was inherently flawed, ugly, and unfit for the American living room. When your employer forces you to hide a piece of your physical self for nearly a decade, it ceases to be acting. It becomes a daily exhausting exercise in forced self-rejection. You cannot subject a human being to that level of daily physical denial without fundamentally fracturing their self-worth. Burghoff was forced to quietly internalize the network's shame regarding his own biology. He was highly compensated, but the paycheck came with the implicit, crushing understanding that he was physically defective goods. The character of Radar was universally beloved, but the man playing him was treated as a damaged asset that required careful, continuous packaging. The mental weight of that paradox is enough to break even the most grounded performer. The bitter irony was deeply embedded in the nature of the character he was portraying. Radar O'Reilly was pitched to the public as the ultimate picture of uncorrupted, transparent innocence. He was the flawless conscience of a war zone who could never tell a lie. Yet the actor providing that innocence was forced into a daily, highly calculated physical deception. The network built a massive altar of purity using a foundation of forced deceit and body shaming. This relentless cover-up, combined with the grueling production schedule, triggered a massive clinical crisis within Burghoff. He was actively operating two distinct parallel lives on the soundstage. One was the effortless, naive clerk delivering reliable punchlines for the audience. The other was a deep, lie-stressed, self-monitoring adult desperately hiding a biological secret from a dozen different camera angles. This cognitive split required immense reserves of mental energy, leaving the actor completely hollowed out by the end of every production week. The television factory does not care what happens when the heavy studio gates finally close for the weekend. The massive exhaustion generated by this daily physical and mental charade did not stay on the lot. Burghoff carried the severe residual tension of the work week straight into his private life. The massive energy required to maintain the corporate illusion left him with absolutely zero emotional reserves for his real-world relationships. His domestic life became the primary unspoken casualty of the CBS production schedule. While the television network was reporting unprecedented, record-breaking profits, Burghoff's actual home life was quietly disintegrating. His marriage was buckling severely under the weight of his chronic absence and profound physical depletion. He was spending all of his available emotional currency projecting a fictional reality for millions of strangers. By the time he walked through his own front door, he was a heavily compromised shell, incapable of being a present partner. The machine was extracting a massive toll, and his family was paying the ultimate price. The viewing public saw a loyal, dependable companion on their screens every single week. His wife saw a man who was being entirely consumed and hollowed out by a corporate entity. The television show demanded his best hours, his sharpest focus, and his maximum emotional output. His family was forced to subsist on the exhausted, irritable scraps he brought home when the cameras stopped rolling. He was a hero to a fictional army, but an absolute ghost inside his own house. This is the brutal paradox of the Hollywood machine that the public rarely gets to see. The more successful the broadcast product becomes, the faster the human asset is drained of its life force. As the Nielsen ratings climb to historic, untouchable heights, Burghoff's personal life reached its absolute nadir. The network executives were purchasing new luxury real estate with the advertising revenue his face generated. Simultaneously, the very foundation of his adult life was collapsing into ruin. A man can only sustain a split, high-stress existence for so long before a total structural failure occurs. Burghoff was rapidly approaching a critical juncture where the physical hiding and the domestic destruction became entirely unsustainable. The studio brass assumed that the massive syndication paychecks would act as a sufficient anesthetic against the pain of a failing marriage. They completely misunderstood the breaking point of the human asset they were so aggressively exploiting. They believed cash could fix a shattered home. When the cracks finally showed and Burghoff formally initiated his exit, the industry immediately misunderstood his motives. Hollywood is a cynical town that strictly communicates in leverage and dollar amounts. When a key actor wants out of a massive hit show, the executives automatically assume it is a heavy-handed negotiation tactic. They immediately leaked stories to the entertainment press, suggesting that Burghoff was holding the network hostage for an astronomical pay raise. They framed him as a greedy diva attempting a shakedown. The network PR machine actively fueled these financial rumors to protect their own bargaining position. They wanted the public to view Burghoff as an ungrateful talent who had let the primetime fame go to his head. It was a calculated, aggressive smear campaign designed to pressure him into returning to the negotiating table out of sheer embarrassment. The executives genuinely believed that if they made the public backlash severe enough, he would fold and sign the papers. They thought they could bully him back into the uniform. These rumors were completely disconnected from the cold, undeniable reality of the situation. This exit wasn't a leverage play for a larger slice of the syndication pie, a better parking spot, or higher billing. He looked directly at the executives and explicitly told them that their money was no longer capable of buying his existence. He was entirely done playing their game. The true catalyst for his departure was a sudden jarring realization regarding his role as a father. He recognized that the broadcast machine was methodically stripping away his fundamental right to raise his own children. He was watching his kids grow up in brief, exhausted increments between demanding production blocks. The character of Radar was going to live forever in syndication reruns, but his children's formative years were actively expiring. He realized he was trading his actual legacy for a television legacy. This realization forced a definitive, irreversible choice that the network executives could not comprehend. He had to deliberately place himself in an impossible corner, leaving absolutely no room for a compromise. He could either retain his status as a highly compensated television icon, or he could salvage what remained of his family. The studio, utterly blind to his crisis, presented him with a massive multi-year contract extension expecting a quick signature. They pushed millions of dollars across the table. Burghoff looked at the document and saw exactly what it was: a highly lucrative, legally binding slave contract. It guaranteed him generational wealth in exchange for the total continued surrender of his domestic life and his physical autonomy. He flatly refused to sign it. He consciously chose to dismantle his own primetime television career to guarantee his survival as a present father. He pushed the millions back across the table. The reaction in the CBS boardroom was a mixture of absolute bewilderment and rising anger. The executives were completely unequipped to handle a major star who genuinely did not care about the money. They threw aggressive counteroffers across the table, desperately trying to find his hidden absolute price tag. They simply could not comprehend that a man would voluntarily step off the most profitable assembly line in entertainment history just to go home. It defied their entire corporate worldview. But the severe damage the studio inflicted during those 7 years was not easily reversed by simply walking away. You do not just turn off a deeply ingrained trauma response, like shutting down a television set. The forced daily concealment of his dysmelia had left permanent, deep-seated scars on his self-image. The chronic exhaustion had permanently altered the trajectory of his marriage, which eventually ended in divorce. The network had extracted their maximum value, leaving behind a heavily compromised human being. The broadcast industry does not offer rehabilitation or support for the actors. It systematically breaks. There is no corporate safety net for a star who refuses to comply and walks away from the spotlight. Once Burghoff made it entirely clear that he was no longer a profitable asset, the studio immediately shifted their focus. They began coldly calculating how to write out the character and maintain their massive advertising revenue without him. He was immediately dead to them. This is how the entertainment monopoly operates at its core. You are a vital, indispensable piece of the corporate family right up until the exact moment you stop generating capital. Then, you are instantly reclassified as a logistical problem that needs to be swiftly eradicated. Burghoff transitioned from a beloved leading man to a corporate headache in the span of a single afternoon. The warmth of the studio evaporated instantly. Walking away from a massive hit television show is rarely a clean break. The studio system operates like a cartel. They do not let high-value assets simply walk out the door without severe, lasting consequences. By Rijay. Cutting their contract and choosing his family, Burghoff had profoundly embarrassed the network brass. He had exposed the ultimate truth that their money and their fame were not the absolute prizes they claimed them to be. He had shown them his back. In Hollywood, embarrassing powerful television executives is a permanent, career-ending offense. Burghoff knew exactly what kind of ruthless retaliation was currently being organized against him. He knew that the very executives who had praised him yesterday would be actively blacklisting him tomorrow. He was preparing to walk off the soundstage and directly into a massive, industry-wide freeze-out. He traded his golden handcuffs for a massive target placed squarely on his back. The transition from signing a contract rejection to filming a final episode is an incredibly hostile process. When CBS commissioned the highly promoted departure event Goodbye Radar, they expected a tear-jerking, highly profitable send-off. They completely underestimated his accumulated resentment. As established by his rebellion on that final set, Burghoff used his remaining screen time to publicly dismantle the illusion. He didn't just rip off the trademark beanie, he fundamentally altered the mechanics of his performance. The script called for the usual bumbling, naive confusion the audience had come to expect. Instead, Burghoff delivered his dialogue with a sharp, undeniable edge of deep irritability and exhaustion. He stopped playing the character as a boy leaving a summer camp and started playing him as a severely burned-out veteran. He snapped his lines, moved with heavy fatigue, and allowed his genuine, real-world frustration to bleed directly onto the film negative. He took a hammer to their most profitable mascot right in front of the showrunners. Burghoff executed this on-set demolition with complete clarity regarding his actions. He was not a naive farm boy expecting a hero's send-off or a sudden change of heart from the executives. He knew the unwritten, ironclad rules of the Hollywood cartel better than anyone. You do not bite the hand that feeds you, especially when that hand belongs to the most powerful broadcast network in America. Before he even stepped onto the lot for that final week of filming, veteran industry insiders had pulled him aside to issue stark warnings. Agents and seasoned producers explicitly pointed to the empty chairs of McLean Stevenson and Larry Linville. Both men had previously attempted to escape the gravitational pull of the hit series in pursuit of independent careers. The network response to their defection had been swift, coordinated, and utterly merciless. Their subsequent television projects were actively starved of promotional budgets or quietly sabotaged by high-level industry politics. The CBS brass had successfully turned his former colleagues into permanent walking cautionary tales. They were used as active leverage against the remaining cast members, a constant reminder of what happens when you cross the network. Burghoff looked at the decimated careers of his predecessors and understood his exact, unavoidable trajectory. The executives were preparing to use him as their next public example to maintain discipline among the remaining talent pool. He signed his departure paperwork, fully recognizing it was a professional termination notice. He was voluntarily trading a lifetime of steady studio paychecks for the absolute certainty of an industry blackout. The moment Goodbye Radar aired and the massive final rating numbers were deposited into the CBS accounts, the studio gates slammed shut. The freeze-out was not a gradual decline. It was immediate and highly coordinated across the entire industry. His powerful talent agency, sensing he was no longer a viable cash cow, quietly stopped returning his urgent phone calls. Casting directors who had previously begged for a few minutes of his time suddenly had completely impenetrable schedules. The Los Angeles entertainment industry operates on a strict hive mind mentality, and the collective decision was made to freeze him out. The broadcast machine is not content with simply denying a defector new work. They require the public devaluation of the asset to be highly visible and humiliating. The studio system effectively closed its premium casting doors. While he'd been a popular guest on daytime circuits like Match Game during his primetime peak, these panel shows suddenly became his only visible outlet. He wasn't hired for his dramatic range. He was booked strictly to conjure up the stuttering, innocent ghost of his former character for quick applause. They wanted the stuttering, the innocence, and the cheap laughs. It was a calculated form of professional degradation. The industry was sending a clear message. You belong at the bottom of the barrel, and you will perform the trick we taught you. This severe career slump was not the result of shifting audience tastes or a sudden lack of talent. It was weaponized typecasting, engineered by vindictive network producers who controlled the casting pipelines. Whenever Burghoff managed to secure an audition for a serious, adult dramatic role, the room was hostile. Casting directors would openly dismiss him, claiming the viewing audience would never accept him as anything other than a subservient teenager. They weaponized his own historic success, turning his Emmy-winning performance into an impenetrable concrete wall. They trapped him in an invisible cage built entirely out of corporate spite. The studios demanded he continuously play the boy on cheap daytime circuits, while aggressively punishing him for daring to grow into a man. He was effectively rendered unemployable in any capacity that required actual acting. The Los Angeles studio system had successfully neutralized a threat to their authority. They proved that no matter how famous you become, the network always holds the ultimate power over your professional existence. However, the absolute peak of corporate cruelty was not the denial of new casting opportunities. It was the massive, silent financial machinery operating flawlessly in the background of his ruined career. While high-level CBS executives actively ensured Burghoff could not secure a single dramatic role in Los Angeles, their distribution arm was working overtime. The network has aggressively pushed his old television episodes into highly lucrative global syndication markets. They packaged his face and sold it to hundreds of local affiliates, running the program 5 days a week across the entire country. The financial paradox was staggering in its cold, calculated efficiency. The studio was pocketing hundreds of millions of dollars in pure profit by continuously broadcasting the very image they were using to destroy him. They effectively turned his youthful recorded face into a perpetual corporate ATM machine. While casting directors told the actual breathing man he was entirely worthless, his digital ghost was generating unprecedented wealth for the boardroom. They achieved the ultimate corporate vengeance. They entirely stripped him of his future livelihood while aggressively, relentlessly monetizing his past. The standard Hollywood playbook for a blacklisted actor involves a highly predictable, humiliating cycle of desperation. You're expected to grovel at the feet of the executives who exiled you, taking degrading bottom-tier cameo roles just to maintain a union card. You hire expensive crisis publicists to plant desperate apology pieces in the industry trade magazines. The machine demands that you publicly repent for your rebellion, admit your absolute reliance on the system, and beg for readmission into the corporate club. Gary Burghoff looked at this pathetic ritual of submission and flatly refused to participate. He understood that remaining in Los Angeles meant fighting a daily unwinnable war of attrition against $1 billion broadcast monopoly. Every time he drove past a studio lot or attended a mandatory industry function, he was volunteering to be a target for vindictive network executives. He realized the only way to actually win the game was to permanently remove his pieces from their board. Without a single word of warning to the entertainment press, he packed his belongings and completely severed his geographical ties to California. He orchestrated a hard, unannounced geographic exile to the opposite end of the continent. Burghoff did not just quietly move out of town, he relocated to the quiet, densely wooded corners of Connecticut. This was a calculated, precise strike against the forced accessibility that Hollywood demands from its human assets. Connecticut is not a place where paparazzi hide in the bushes or powerful casting directors happen to bump into you at an upscale restaurant. It is a geographically and culturally insulated environment designed to repel the aggressive transactional nature of the West Coast. He built a heavily guarded, fiercely private fortress far outside the reach of the broadcast signal. Once established on the East Coast, he methodically executed a total communications blackout with the industry that created him. He fired the remaining agents who had already stopped returning his calls and completely dismantled the PR apparatus that managed his public image. If a studio executive or gossip columnist wanted to reach Gary Burghoff, they found dead phone lines and unforwarded mail. He systematically cut every single wire connecting him to the Los Angeles power grid. He became an absolute ghost to the very people who were actively making millions of dollars syndicating his face. The contrast between his former existence and his new reality was absolute and intentional. In Los Angeles, his worth was calculated daily by men in expensive suits analyzing overnight demographic data and advertising yields. In his new East Coast sanctuary, his value was entirely self-determined and disconnected from any corporate metric. He traded the suffocating, windowless artificial environment of a soundstage for the open, unpredictable reality of the New England seasons. He was finally breathing unconditioned air, far away from the stale atmosphere of the television factory. This was not a passive retirement. It was an active pursuit of professional anonymity. Stripped of the ability to practice his primary craft on his own terms, he pivoted to an entirely solitary medium. He took up watercolor painting, focusing exclusively on highly detailed, realistic portraits of North American wildlife. There are no network notes in wildlife painting, no directors demanding a higher vocal pitch, and no Nielsen ratings to dictate the brushstrokes. It was a silent, meticulous reclamation of his own artistic agency. Wildlife painting demands a rigid adherence to biological truth and immense natural patience. You cannot rush the drying of watercolors, and you cannot fake the precise anatomy of a heron or a fox to appease a sponsor. This artistic discipline was the exact deliberate antithesis of the television factory he had just escaped. The studio demanded instant, highly manufactured emotional responses delivered on a strict, punishing taping schedule. His canvas demanded slow, honest observation of a world that existed completely outside of human ego and corporate demands. He spent his days studying the anatomy of animals, sitting quietly in nature without a camera lens shoved in his face. The man, who had once been forced to hide his left hand behind a clipboard, was now using it to create intricate visual art. He was no longer a human prop manipulated by a corporate scriptwriter for cheap laughs. He was the sole author of his work, answering to absolutely no one but his own standards. The paintings were a quiet, devastating rejection of the loud, artificial world he had permanently left behind. When he required the visceral energy of performance, he did not seek out a theater stage or a film set. He quietly integrated himself into the local Connecticut music scene, picking up his drumsticks. He played the drums in obscure small-town jazz bands, performing in local venues and municipal parks for handfuls of people. There were no bright studio lights, no oppressive laugh tracks, and no makeup chairs to hide his aging face. He was simply a middle-aged man keeping time in the back of a bandstand, entirely unconcerned with his former television royalty status. The network, desperate to plug the massive hole his departure left in their prime-time schedule, attempted to engineer a replacement. They introduced new cast members, carefully designed by committee to capture the exact same innocent demographic. It was a massive, highly funded failure of corporate calculation. You can build a new set and write new jokes, but you cannot artificially synthesize the highly specific sacrificial energy Burghoff had bled into the camera. The audience noticed the synthetic nature of the replacement instantly, proving his unique value that the executives refused to respect. The American public, entirely conditioned by the media, struggled to comprehend his total disappearance from the spotlight. Entertainment magazines ran highly speculative, invasive pieces, attempting to locate the missing primetime star. When they discovered he was painting birds and playing jazz in a small town, they framed it as a severe mental breakdown. The audience, consuming these heavily biased narratives, viewed his new life as a tragic, pathetic end to a once promising career. They fundamentally believed that a man could only be happy if he was famous, wealthy, and visible on their television screens. The viewers flatly rejected the existence of an independent, aging man named Gary Burghoff. They only wanted to consume the image of Radar O'Reilly, the subservient, eager-to-please boy who lived in their syndication reruns. This mass rejection was the ultimate, depressing proof of how deeply the CBS network had manipulated the public's cognitive reality. The audience had been aggressively trained to prefer a comfortable, profitable corporate fabrication over a real, breathing human being. When Burghoff presented them with his actual self, they recoiled in absolute disinterest. His inability to find mainstream acceptance post-television was never an issue of evaporated talent or lost skill. It was the direct result of a highly successful, decade-long corporate brainwashing campaign executed by the studio system. The network had cemented an image in the public consciousness so deeply that it became impenetrable armor. No matter how brilliantly he painted or how tightly he played the drums, the public refused to see anything but a farm boy from Iowa. The network had successfully weaponized the American audience against the actor. The Los Angeles tabloids gleefully weaponized his quiet life, turning him into an industry punchline. They labeled him a bitter, washed-up eccentric who had foolishly bitten the hand that fed him millions of dollars. They pointed to his modest Connecticut home and his obscure jazz gigs as undeniable proof of his colossal professional failure. Industry trades used him as the ultimate cautionary tale, framing his exit as absolute professional ruin to maintain discipline among the remaining talent pool. The media's obsession with framing him as a tragic casualty reveals the deep fundamental sickness of the entertainment ecosystem. They literally cannot process the concept of a man voluntarily choosing quiet dignity over massive public adulation. To the agents, producers, and publicists of Los Angeles, fame is an absolute, unquestionable religion. Walking away from the altar is considered an act of severe, unforgivable heresy that must be punished. They had to burn his reputation at the stake to prevent the spread of his dangerous, independent ideology among the remaining talent pool. Hollywood relies lie on the illusion that its validation is the only currency that matters in the world. They need the public, and more importantly, their own employees, to believe that life outside the studio system is a barren wasteland. If an actor proves that you can leave the cartel and find genuine peace, the entire power structure of the industry is heavily threatened. Therefore, the executives and the press had to systematically humiliate Burghoff in the public square. His personal happiness in Connecticut was a direct, existential threat to their corporate authority. But the narrative they spun was a desperate, transparent fabrication designed to protect their own fragile egos. The executives sitting in their glass towers could not fathom a man who valued his sanity over a syndicated paycheck. They projected their own hollow, money-obsessed anxieties onto his quiet, voluntary exile. They called him a loser because they were absolutely terrified of what his departure actually represented. He had exposed the massive, gaping hole at the very center of the Hollywood dream. The reality of his life in Connecticut was the exact opposite of the tragic failure the media desperately wanted to portray. He was waking up every morning on his own terms, without a production assistant banging on his trailer door at dawn. He was raising his children in a stable, quiet environment, far removed from the toxic, artificial reality of a Los Angeles soundstage. He was no longer forced to physically hide his congenital condition or artificially pitch his voice to appease a demographic algorithm. He had successfully clawed his way out of a psychological meat grinder. This deliberate exile was a tactical, flawless execution of an extraction plan. You cannot win a fight against a massive media conglomerate by playing by their rules or begging for their mercy. You defeat them by entirely removing your biological fuel from their corporate engine. Every day Burghoff spent painting in the woods was a day. The studio could not exploit his actual living body. He starved the executives of the one thing they desperately craved, his total unwavering compliance. By retreating into total silence, he completely neutralized the power of the entertainment press. Tabloids require engagement, scandal, and desperate comeback attempts to sell their magazines at the checkout aisle. When a subject simply refuses to participate, the smear campaigns eventually run out of oxygen and die completely. Burghoff offered them absolutely nothing to twist, manipulate, or monetize. He defeated the Los Angeles media machine using the undeniable, impenetrable power of total apathy. The defining twist of Gary Burghoff's career is that his absolute banishment was never a punishment. The industry believed they were executing a harsh, career-ending sentence by permanently locking him out of the studio gates. They had it completely, fundamentally backward. His sudden, permanent disappearance from the television landscape was a deliberate, total victory. He used their own vindictive Blacklist as a protective shield to guard his newly reclaimed life from further exploitation. By actively ensuring he would never work in a major Hollywood production again, he guaranteed his permanent freedom. He effectively tricked the television cartel into setting him free, letting them believe it was their brilliant idea to exile him. He stands as one of the rarest entities in the ruthless history of American entertainment. He is an actor who walked directly into the center of the studio machine, extracted his life, and escaped with his humanity entirely intact. Being completely discarded by Hollywood was the only mathematical way to avoid rotting from the inside out. The passage of half a century offers a brutal, highly clarifying perspective on the exact mechanics of the Hollywood broadcast machine. Today, at over 80 years old, Gary Burghoff occupies a heavily insulated existence, entirely detached from the Los Angeles studio apparatus. He successfully outlived the intense manufactured relevancy that the network desperately wielded as a weapon against him. A television soundstage is a hostile environment of extreme sensory overload. Burghoff traded that industrial chaos for a fortress of natural pacing. He completely reclaimed his physical autonomy, ensuring his body would never again be censored or contorted to appease a corporate aesthetic. Outside the secure borders of his New England property, the broadcast cartel operates on a completely frozen, highly lucrative alternate timeline. Deep inside climate-controlled server farms and satellite uplinks across the globe, the network continues to distribute the exact same canned laughter and highly engineered innocence. The digital phantom of Radar O'Reilly remains permanently trapped in a 1970s time loop, forced to repeat the same bumbling physical comedy and rapid-fire punchlines hour after hour. The studio is still actively working that character in the global syndication mines, aggressively milking a 50-year-old intellectual property. They package his youthful, panicked face to sell premium advertising slots on modern streaming platforms. This continuous loop generates massive, uninterrupted revenue for contemporary corporate executives who were not even born when the pilot episode premiered. The network achieved its ultimate terrifying corporate objective. It successfully separated the highly profitable image from the breathing man. They discarded the deteriorating biological asset while keeping the immortal mask permanently on the payroll. This jarring geographical and temporal contrast completely shatters the ultimate primetime illusion sold to the American public. The viewing audience of the 1970s was handed a heartwarming sitcom family, a weekly half-hour dose of psychological comfort broadcast directly into their living rooms to distract from a turbulent political era. The public consumed the sanitized blow CKS of entertainment without ever questioning the brutal mechanics of the factory that manufactured them. The series was universally praised by television critics as a groundbreaking moral commentary on the absurdity of a foreign conflict. Yet the production environment itself was a domestic war of attrition. Behind the dependable smiles and the heavily promoted camaraderie of the ensemble cast operated a highly efficient, entirely ruthless industrial complex. The executives sitting in the corner offices of television networks do not view actors as artists, collaborators, or human beings. They view them strictly as highly perishable biological hardware, required to operate a profitable software program. The broadcast industry operates on a system that demands total ownership of a performer's physical reality. They ordered Burghoff to systematically bury his own anatomy, forcing him to contort his posture and hide his hand for 14 grueling hours a day. They demanded he carry the massive weight of their corporate shame just to protect a fragile, profitable demographic algorithm. It is a business model built on extracting the maximum emotional and physical yield from a captive employee while offering absolutely zero structural protection when the asset begins to show signs of clinical exhaustion. The entire Hollywood power structure relies on unwavering, desperate compliance. The precise second an actor dares to demand baseline jurisdiction over their own biology, the machine automatically initiates a coordinated, industry-wide termination sequence. The studio retaliation was not a subtle shift in casting preferences. It was a highly visible, weaponized campaign of professional exile. When Burghoff refused to sign a massive contract extension that essentially demanded his continued physical submission in exchange for generational wealth, the cartel exacted its standard penalty. They systematically stripped his leading man status and funneled him directly into the degrading, brightly lit circuits of daytime panel shows. It was a calculated isolation tactic designed to humiliate him publicly. The executives wanted to utilize his sudden career slump as a terrifying visual deterrent for the rest of the talent pool. They intended to parade him around as a broken, unemployable warning sign to ensure no other breakout star dared to challenge the assembly line schedule. But the boardroom executives fundamentally misunderstood the psychology of their target. The Los Angeles entertainment monopoly runs entirely on the currency of desperation. They expect exiled actors to eventually crawl back, hire expensive crisis publicists, and beg for readmission into the corporate club. Burghoff short-circuited their entire punitive system by simply refusing to care about the punishment. He had already calculated the exact professional cost of his departure and paid it willingly. He executed a flawless, unannounced tactical extraction, recognizing that remaining on the top-rated program in the country guaranteed the permanent destruction of his central nervous system. Close the file on Gary Burghoff. In the highly sanitized, heavily PR-managed history of American television, he stands as a completely isolated, factual anomaly. He is the top-tier primetime asset who looked directly into the lens of a billion-dollar capitalist machine, recognized the psychological trap closing around him, and actively walked off the board. He voluntarily traded a hollow broadcast legacy, a wall of industry awards, and a lifetime of guaranteed studio paychecks to secure something the network could never comprehend or monetize: his absolute biological sovereignty. He won back his fundamental right to active fatherhood, ensuring he was a present, grounded figure in his children's actual lives rather than a completely hollowed-out ghost returning from a soundstage at midnight. He secured a quiet, highly functional existence on the opposite side of the continent, beyond the reach of industry, access journalists, and vindictive casting directors. The Hollywood cartel genuinely believed they had ruined his life by permanently locking the heavy studio gates behind him. They entirely failed to realize he had engineered his own escape. He built a permanent reality that will never again be dictated, measured, or disrupted by the quarterly financial reports of media moguls. He didn't lose his television career to a tragic industry misstep. He deliberately, methodically starved his own celebrity to death so the breathing man behind the uniform could finally survive.